as always, and welcome back, everyone. It's good to see faces that are becoming familiar, and pleasure to continue working with all of you. And just a reminder, as always, I'm going to try to leave a little bit more time today for question and answer. So remember to put your questions, which are always excellent questions, in the chat, and Sherelle will then minister that toward the end. We have been moving through a very broad survey of Jewish history, which is a very big and broad topic, by emphasizing certain major themes of that history. The first theme was Jews as a people. The Jewish people was our first theme. The second theme was the book, that sometimes it characterizes this people as the people of the book being the Bible, more specifically the Torah. That was our second theme. We talked primarily about its origins and its early composition, and in the context in which it was composed in that ancient world of ancient Israel. But of course, as a theme, it persists throughout Jewish history. And so we might think about how these two first themes are interrelated. The people gave rise to, created, generated that religious, extraordinary religious literature over the course of several centuries that we can call the Torah. So that's one connection. And then now that we have the Torah, once the Torah becomes our foundational document, it then returns the favor and helps to preserve the Jewish people throughout their history. It's sometimes said to be the principal reason that Jews have survived for such a very long time is their quite extraordinary foundation in the Torah. We sing that it's the Shabbat that preserved the Jewish people. I think more accurately, the Torah has preserved the Jewish people through the ages. So those first two themes clearly are interrelated, and similarly, they are both related to today's theme. Today's theme being the diaspora. The Jews were born as a people in a given land, much like every other people, much like the French. I made the analogy to America and Americans, but really a better analogy would be to any historical nation: the Chinese, the Indians, the French, the Germans. I mean, all of those are peoples that are born in a particular land, have a particular language, and thereafter a history. Well, Jews originated in the very same way and should be thought of in a similar way, with one major exception. Early on in their history, the majority of them were dispersed away from their homeland and live in what we call, and I'll talk more about the terms in a bit, a diaspora, a dispersal. And that will be the majority Jewish condition. There will always be some small Jewish presence in the homeland of Israel, but for the most part, most Jews throughout most of Jewish history have lived elsewhere around the world. We call that elsewhere the diaspora. And that means that the Jews as a people are not exactly like every other people, right? They had and this is one of the questions we'll raise today. I was about to say they had the disadvantage, but it might be argued it's an advantage of living as a dispersed people, and yet have retained their sense of a unified identity as the Jewish people, despite that spread. And we'll talk more about that today. And then it also relates, the diaspora relates to the book, to the Torah. It's been said that, first of all, you'll recall from last week that the Torah was completed. Its formation, its ultimate formation and consolidation was prompted largely by the experience of losing their home, being cast into exile, yearning for return in the Babylonian exile, and even perhaps in the earlier Assyrian conquest and exile. There was also a spur to the creation of a system written down that could be taken with him, that was portable. In fact, sometimes the Torah has been called a kind of a portable homeland, that wherever we have gone around the world, in carrying the Torah with us, we've carried the memory and thus the connection to that original land. So the Torah and the religious system that will flow from it become a substitute and become a mechanism, a means by which the Jews will persevere and survive through time and space. So these themes shouldn't be thought of as completely separate. They're all interconnected, interrelated in one way or another. Again, today we're going to focus on diaspora, and the first, in order to apply now the history memory duality that we've been working with, let's go back to the Bible, because funnily enough, both the history and today I've been using the word perspective, the perspective of history, the perspective of memory. Let's stick with that word. Both perspectives and then will emerge from that as a kind of an attitude, even a kind of an emotional orientation coming from those perspectives. Both the history perspective and the memories perspective are both to be found in the biblical record, in one or another of the books of the Bible. And what do I mean by that? Let's go to our first, okay. So for those of you that, like myself, are not particularly technologically adept, Sherelle tells me that you can now manipulate this image. If the printing is not big enough to read, you're able to enlarge that. So I welcome you to do that. Sherelle is nodding her head, and for some people that's that's a given. For others, that was a new insight. So I thank you for that, Sherelle. The first biblical passage that relates is a very well-known one. I'm sure you're all quite familiar with this. It is Psalm 137, the very famous "By the Rivers of Babylon." This is also well known not only as a psalm, but has been put to music and is now a contemporary hymn that is often sung in synagogue. And it is one of those biblical texts that has resonated throughout the ages and is very much part of our, in a way, it's part of our cultural DNA in a very powerful way. And it bespeaks that this first attitude toward the experience of leaving one's home and hoping for return. It begins, "By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat." I want you to just pause there for a moment and take in the tense of that sentence. Where is this psalm being written in all likelihood? Not in Babylon, right? This is in all likelihood written by a psalmist who was in exile in Babylon and has now returned. Remember, under the edict of Cyrus, the Judean exiles in Babylon were permitted to return, and many did, not all, but some did return. And one of those sat back in the homeland, is writing this, is expressing their memory of having been in exile. There we sat and wept as we thought of Zion. Very, very compelling emotional distress, that feeling of having been kicked out of one's home, of having lost everything familiar, everything comfortable, and you are cast away into a strange land, strangers in a strange land, right? That's the experience of exile. And the psalmist is giving voice to that very painful emotion of homelessness and exile. There on the poplars, we hung up our lyres, for our captors asked us there for songs. Our tormentors asked us to amuse them, for amusement. They said, "Sing us one of the songs of Zion." To which we replied, "How can we sing a song of the Lord here on alien soil?" In other words, we are not at home any longer, and we have been not only cast out of our land, but we've been cast away from God's holy city, from God, the promised land, the holy land to the Jews. We are no longer in our home. How can we express our love and our reverence for God in this strange place? In other words, being in exile means I'm no longer myself. I was in covenant with God in the land, and in a certain painful way, that covenant has been broken. And then the psalmist continues, "If I forget you, O Jerusalem," this, of course, is the most famous part of the psalm. "If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand wither, let my tongue cleave to my palate. If I cease to think of you, if I do not keep Jerusalem in memory, even at my happiest hour." And of course, this is one of the key texts in the very long Jewish tradition of remembering where we came from, our homeland of the land of Israel, of the holy promised land, and yearning for it, deepening our feeling of connection to it, understanding that God gave it to us, and for some unexplained reason, God has taken it away from us. Now, let me suggest to you that this psalm is, I take it in a kind of historical vein. In other words, someone who actually did experience the brokenness of exile, expressed those feelings more or less in that time period. And we're getting a glimpse, we have a window into the emotional life of Judean exile in that era. And this is true throughout history of all peoples that lose their home and are forced to flee and thereafter to wander. It is a very disorienting, even painful experience. We have that attitude, again, that perspective, that emotion of brokenness, of being kicked out, of being homeless, of being not fully oneself, no longer in one's home. That emotion, let's call it, runs throughout the Jewish tradition. And the word that encapsulates that is the Hebrew word galut, G-A-L-U-T. It is translated as exile. And exile is not only a physical condition, it is a spiritual condition. It's certainly an emotional state of homelessness, of exile. It is worth pointing out that that in itself is a major theme of the Jewish experience and of the Jewish tradition. I'll just give you an example. There's a book entitled Galut, written by a very prominent, important contemporary Jewish thinker named Arnold Eisen. Arnie Eisen was the chancellor of the Jewish Theological, not Technological, Seminar. I'm just teasing. The JTS, he was the chancellor for many years. He's now still a professor there. He wrote a book entitled Galut, and this is what I'm about to read is an excerpt from a summary he wrote for another publication. He writes, in order to introduce the theme of exile, Galut, he writes, the banishment of Adam and Eve at the very beginning of Genesis introduces a theme that stamps all the 5 books of Moses. From Abraham's departures for Canaan and beyond, through the Israelites' extended wanderings in the wilderness, to the marvelous promise of home conveyed near the end of Deuteronomy and promptly overwhelmed by the threat of renewed homelessness, the Torah is preoccupied with exile as it never could be with paradise. So it is with the rest of the Bible, and so it has been with Jewish reflection ever since. We Jews, given our historical experience and then the memory we created based on that, are preoccupied with exile. Now, exile, as I've been emphasizing, is a kind of a negative attitude or feeling. It is the opposite of being whole and at peace. It's being broken and in a state of disrepair. And it, as I say, it extends throughout the Jewish experience. It's certainly in the Bible. And again, I'll remind you that much of the Bible is written in that, or at least finished in that moment of exile and homelessness and yearning for restoration. The Bible's written in that context, and therefore that attitude is shot through the Bible for good reason, but it will continue to inform Jewish tradition ever after. We'll be talking about the rabbis and Rabbinic Judaism in a few classes, so I'll leave that for them. But let me skip ahead to an extraordinary development in this tradition, and that is in the mystical tradition of the Kabbalah, which we associate with the Middle Ages primarily. The great work of Zohar, the great work of Kabbalah called the Zohar, is written in the 13th century. So it's then, and also then a few centuries later, with the Lurianic Kabbalah that comes out of Tzafat in northern Israel, written by mostly Sephardic Jews who had been exiled from the Iberian Peninsula. The Spanish and Portuguese expulsions created a Sephardic diaspora, part of which finds its way to the land of Israel. And there, a new version of the Kabbalah is developed, and a major theme of the Kabbalah, especially the Lurianic variety, is exile in a spiritual sense. The notion that we are all, like Adam and Eve, cast out of the Garden of Eden as the human condition. It is more specifically the Jewish condition, and the Kabbalists will then even extend that to God himself. God is in exile with us. God is broken. God is in need of repair and restoration, as are we, and we need to partner with God to effect that. Very compelling, powerful set of images and ideas and theological concepts, so that exile as a historical experience will ultimately become a key element of the Jewish religious tradition and theological speculation and the like. And then finally, I would also relate this theme in the history of the Jews to modern day Israel, the contemporary state of Israel. Or rather to the history of Zionism. Excuse me, let's just take one step back. Zionism emerges in the late 19th century as a secularized, politicized new movement toward effecting the return to Zion, to Israel, and the rebuilding of a Jewish life there, and ultimately a Jewish state. But part of Zionism, an important theme of Zionism for early on, is called in Hebrew, and I just, as I'm about to say this, I remember in an earlier lecture on Zionism, I remember talking about this as well. I remember Shirel, reacting to hearing this phrase. That phrase was shlilat hagalut, the negation of exile. That part of Zionist thought, part of Zionist ideology, is a negation, is a negative assessment of the condition of exile, of Jewish life outside of Israel, is seen as a negative, is seen as something that we need to correct, is seen as a malady that we need to heal. Diaspora / exile / galut through a Zionist lens is an aberration at best, a sickness at worst, and we have to heal. And we heal through Zionism and the resettlement and the rebuilding of Israel. So exile has a very long history. It is as Arnie Eisen did, one could easily write a book about it as a central theme of the Jewish tradition. But let me now go back to the beginning and just share with you kind of a mapping of this. Let's see, which map do I want? Here we go. Okay. So this is, we used a timeline last week as a tool to recapture and interpret history. And maps are also a very good tool, especially for today's subject, when we're talking about a spatial topic, the geographic spread of Jews. And this is a helpful map showing you those first two early exiles. Remember the Assyrian conquest in 722 BCE, and then the Babylonian conquest and exile in 586 BCE. These are the two early catastrophes that befall the Jewish people. They are both directly related to the formation of the religious literature called Torah, and the Torah in turn reflects this actual historical experience, although the Assyrian one is a little bit murkier in terms of what we feel can be said about it. Most historians agree that this in all likelihood did happen. We don't know exactly what happened to those exiles. The memory of the exiled northern Israelites became that they were lost to us. They were lost to history, and thus the 10 lost tribes of Israel. The reality is that many of them probably did preserve their Jewish identities, whether in exile or back home, or some perhaps escaped elsewhere. As I mentioned in an earlier class, many of them were refugees who escaped down south into Judea. They certainly survived. Someone asked the question about the Samaritans before, and I misstated a bit to suggest that the Samaritans, and again, this is historical theory, we believe what we believe. We believe the Samaritans to be not primarily a remnant of the 10 lost tribes, as I misstated last week, but rather the Assyrians in conquering would have carted away the local population and then resettled their own elements of their own population. So most historians believe that the Samaritans are descended from resettled Assyrians. So they were not ethnically speaking part of the people of Israel, but as is always the case here, the greater likelihood is that it was a mixed bag, and that it was a mixed population in various ways. But that was the earlier Syrian one. The Babylonian exile, we historians feel that we're on firmer ground in terms of talking about the historicity of those events. And here we know from the available sources, biblical and outside the Bible, that the conquering Babylonians carted away, again, I'll use that phrase, they exiled the aristocracy, the leadership, leaving most of the people in place in Judea, but they exiled as a way of kind of decapitating Judean society. They brought back to Babylonia the royal courts, the priesthood, etc. So we have, from that moment onward, we have the first major diaspora community that is as early as 586. There were likely Jews living outside of Israel prior to that. There were likely self-identified Jewish or Israelite satellite communities around the ancient world, but the majority of Jews lived in their own land until this very important turning point of the Babylonian exile, 586 BCE, when it's not that most Jews leave, it's that a major new center of Jewish life is established outside of Israel. And that thus is the beginning of what we term in very broad, what we call in very broad terms, the diaspora. Now, both of these early instances were in fact caused by the conquest of a foreign enemy, the tragic destruction of a part of Israel, and thus the experience of leaving Israel was a forced expulsion, and therefore very painful, negative experience. And that goes to the negativity associated with galut, as I spelled out earlier. However, there is another way of thinking about this historical phenomenon of Jews spreading abroad, leaving the land of Israel, settling elsewhere around the ancient world, and forming communities of self-identified Jews who are able to preserve Jewish life by virtue of the various adjustments that they will make. One of them is bringing the Torah with them. The Torah is seen as holy and can be carried with one wherever a Jewish community finds itself. Another interesting mechanism that I'll cite, I touched on it earlier, the psalmist, that attitude toward exile is something that in that moment is somewhat new, I'd like to suggest. That yearning for Jerusalem, if I forget thee, O Jerusalem, that elevating the connection to Jerusalem to a level of sanctity and all importance. I'd like to suggest to you that prior to being expelled, one does not necessarily have that feeling, that attitude toward one's land. One takes it for granted. Nowhere in the Bible, for example, is the land of Israel talked about as particularly holy. It is God's promised land to the Jewish people, but elevating it further to occupying a status of holiness in and of itself, that is that really comes into focus once we are exiled, once we lose it, and it suddenly becomes of mythic, symbolic importance, in addition to simply missing one's home. That's the way religious sentiment often evolves. It comes out of more banal, mundane experience, and we elevate something to a much higher level of importance. It's only when you lose it that you begin to think of it in those terms. So I want to associate that feeling of yearning to return home, that sense of brokenness in exile, and the related sanctity of the land that one yearns for, and especially Jerusalem, called in biblical verse Sion, Zion, refers to the holiness of the city of Jerusalem. That concept, that level of sanctity, is only really asserts itself once it's lost. All of that, again, is the galut perspective. I haven't used the word until now, but everything I've been talking about is a matter of memory. The attitude we have toward being cut off from home and toward the homeland itself becomes a part of Jewish memory, part of the Jewish tradition, part of, once again, this is the story we tell to define who we are. It's what makes Jews Jews. It's what informs our tradition throughout. History in our last two classes was often very sharply opposed to the memory perspective. Today, it's a little bit more subtle a divide, but there is an opposition nonetheless. And for that, let me go to, let's see, here we go. Let me go back to this, and now we want to read the next passage from the Bible. This is from the book of Jeremiah. Jeremiah was the prophet who was the prophet of the Babylonian exile. He lived in Jerusalem during those years leading up to it. He prophesied that such a tragedy was going to happen. He was persecuted for his prophecy, for his for being a Debbie Downer, for being such a negative voice during those years leading up to the Babylonian exile. And then when the Babylonians conquer, he flees into exile in Egypt and lives out the rest of his life in his own exile in Egypt. But he sends from his own exiled place, he sends a very famous letter to the exiled community in Babylon. And that letter is reproduced in the book of his prophecies, the book of Jeremiah. And here again, we historians have no reason to doubt that this actually took place, that Jeremiah did live. He did prophesy as recorded in his book. He may not have been the one who wrote every word as tradition has it, but this is a considered historical figure. And this letter he writes and sends to the exiles is also a kind of an statement regarding the Jewish attitude toward life in dispersal. He writes, this is the text of the letter which the prophet Jeremiah sent from Jerusalem to the priests, the prophets, the rest of the elders of the exiled community, and to all the people whom Nebuchadnezzar had exiled from Jerusalem to Babylon. After King Jehoiachin, the queen mother, the eunuchs, the officials of Judah, Jerusalem, and the craftsmen and smiths had left Jerusalem. This letter was sent through Elasah, son of Shaphan, and Gemariah, son of Kilkiah, whom King Zedekiah of Judah had dispatched to Babylon. And wait a second, let me just get rid of this. Oops, I'm sorry. Okay. Thus said the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, to the whole community which I exiled from Jerusalem to Babylon. I, God, exiled from Jerusalem to Babylon. Build, and this is now through the medium of the prophet, this is the word of God. Thus spoke the Lord God to Jeremiah to tell the people. God says, build houses and live in them. Plant gardens and eat their fruit. Take wives and beget sons and daughters, and take wives for your sons, and give your daughters to husbands, that they may bear sons and daughters. Multiply there, do not decrease. and seek the welfare of the city to which I have exiled you, and pray to the Lord in its behalf, for in its prosperity you shall prosper. Now, this too has become a very famous passage in the high holiday machzor that we used in my shul, in my synagogue. We had a prayer for the country, for the United States, that repeated this very famous passage from the book of Jeremiah, because it is something that has also, once in the Bible, becomes a matter of Jewish memory and is therefore informed Jewish consciousness and Jewish behavior throughout much of our history. And that is when we find ourselves in a foreign land, whether through exile or through other means I'll come back to. God wants us not to sit and cry. God wants us not to stop praying and feel disconnected and spiritually dead. God wants us to live in those foreign lands, in a prosperous way, build houses, have families, contribute to the society of which you're a part. Now, this is an attitude toward diaspora, which is very different from the negative view of galut, of exile, that I spelled out earlier. This is a far more accepting, accommodating, and realistic understanding of, well, if you find yourself in a foreign land, settle down, make it your home, become a part of it, contribute to its society. This is also a part of Jewish tradition. We find the woe is me sense of galut in the Bible, but we also find this more pragmatic approach to building a new home. God okayed it. So there is this tension, even as early as the Bible, between these two competing attitudes. And that tension also shows up in our theme of history versus memory. The memory side of the coin emphasizes the negative, emphasizes the notion that wherever we live in the world that's not in the land of Israel, we are not really at home, and that we are eternally, perpetually a homeless people. And you can see how that directly informs the modern movement of Zionism. And this tension, this underlying notion that there's something not quite right with Jews living outside of Israel. Again, the shlilat hagalut, the negation of the exile, a lot of people still have that feeling of, it's not really home. Wherever we go in the world, there will always be anti-Semitism. Well, they'll never fully accept us. Well, even though we thought we had it good in Germany and we thought we had it good in America, this is still exile. We're still not at home. So you can hear both how that is Zionistically flavored and also as part of the consciousness of many Jews in the world, especially since the Holocaust, which was kind of, for many, in a completely understandable way, for many was the ultimate proof that the world will never accept us and we can never fully be at home anywhere outside of Israel. So that's the one part of the story. The other part, and I think what the study of history and historical perspective offers, is more nuanced, more balanced, more subtle thought about the same topic. And it does see the way in which life in diaspora has very often been a new normal, has been a home. That throughout Jewish history, Jews have spread all over the world, and wherever they've gone, they have generally settled down and formed a new world for themselves. That doesn't more often than not, it will not last forever. But the fact that it lasts for a century or centuries is historically meaningful. We were very much at home in Constantinople and in Tunisia and in Hamburg and in Ireland and all over the world. So those were Jewish diasporas, which can be thought of as in negative terms, as I've spelled out, but can also be thought of in a more neutral way, in a more objective way. And that's the viewpoint of history. And so to convey that, let's look at some more maps. Here, let's see, this is a good one. Okay. This is a map of the growth of diaspora Now, from 722. Now, 722 was an exile, and the Babylonian conquest was an exile. But look at these arrows. What do they represent? They don't represent forced expulsion, which is certainly a part of Jewish history and will occur, especially once we get to the Middle Ages. There will be a series of such expulsions. But throughout this very lengthy history, Jews have always been on the move. Jews have been subject to migration, is a much better word. Voluntary migration rather than forced expulsion has been a historical characteristic of Jews throughout. Now, what probably enabled this was the lack of feeling fully at home. So there is always the slightly more tenuous connection one has to wherever one finds itself at present. And often throughout history, there were anti-Jewish elements and trends that emerged to deepen this feeling of I don't want to stay around here and let's move elsewhere. But let's remember that historically, when peoples migrate, when peoples move, certainly persecution is a part of is one part of the set of motivations. But there are many other motivations as well. The principal one always being economic opportunity. Where I live currently, the economy is bad. For whatever reason, I'm not able to earn a good living. Let's resettle elsewhere. Let's open a new trade route. Let's go to a larger city where commerce is livelier. All sorts of reasons like that prompt people to migrate, to emigrate from their land and immigrate to a new land. That is the process of migration, which has characterized Jews throughout. The myth of the eternal wandering Jew has a lot of truth to it. Jews have long been prone to moving. This is a theme throughout. Shouldn't be taken as an absolute. There are always lots of exceptions, but it is different from the notion of exile. I live in Rome because I am in exile from the Holy Land, as opposed to I live in Rome because I used to live somewhere else in Southern Europe, and we came here because life would be better here. This map gives you, I think, a better sense of that. And let me share with you some other maps along similar lines. Here we go. Here's a map from the Jewish world in 300 AD. This is just before the Roman Empire will adopt Christianity. And you can see the dotted line is the extent of the Roman Empire in that moment. It's kind of more or less the height of the Roman Empire. You see the hatched areas, the shaded areas, are where most Jews live. So most Jews around the year 300 are living still in Asia Minor, today's Turkey, today's Iraq, Syria, right? Those and the land of Israel. And then there's a growing presence along the northern coast of Africa, also part of the Roman Empire. And as you can see, there are Jews as far west as Italy in that early period. Now, how do they get there? Why are they there? If you visit Rome today, you can see that very famous bas-relief of exiles being led away after the destruction of the Second Temple. And that's part of the story. But part of the story is that Jews spread along with the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire was so-called civilization of that era. And that was where one could find safety and security and economic prospects as well. And Jews were often part of the administration of a given city or region and the economic role they played. And again, various reasons for this spread. And similarly, I'll show you also. Must be a quicker way of doing this. I'll have to take here's another one a little bit later. Here we see 300 years later, you see the spread, first of all, the concentration in the eastern part of this, the area that is going very soon to be overrun by the Islamic Empire. The Jewish presence there is not quite as central as it was, and they are moving around the Mediterranean. Now, there were no Jewish expulsions in the second, third, fourth, fifth centuries. This is just part of that natural process of migration. So I give you all of this to give you a sense of, whoops, a sense of the dichotomy between galut, exile, and diaspora, natural spread. They're both part of both memory and history. They both are operable in the historical record, but clearly you now, I hope, understand the way we Jews, adhering to our tradition, learning from our rabbis and our texts and our communal memory, we often tend to emphasize one over the other. And in that regard, modern day history can offer a kind of corrective to balance it out a bit more. This attitude, this contrast or opposition of attitudes has kind of come back nowadays. I'll come back to that at the end. Let me first, let's first, well, I also want to relate the way in which the memory has become part of the fabric of Jewish consciousness. A very important Jewish historian named Selo Baron, early in the 20th century, gave this attitude a name. He called it the Lacrose conception of Jewish history. And that he suggested that most Jews look at their historical experience in a lachrymose way, in a mournful or tearful way. Oh, we were constantly persecuted and constantly exiled and killed, and we were constantly on the run from, and that overemphasis on something that is certainly part of the historical record, but the dwelling in that is what Baron meant by the lachrymose attitude toward Jewish history. I think that that can be related to today's subject. In the same way that if we don't have a more balanced, nuanced understanding of the history of exile and persecution, together with the history of diaspora culture and its development and the positives we can associate with that, one can easily fall too far in one direction. So I just wanted to make that point that that there is a tendency on the part of much of Jewish life to emphasize one over the other. And therefore, we historians tend to advocate for the other, to do a little bit of affirmative action for diaspora as a potentially good thing, right? And so there is an argument that, in fact, diaspora is good for the Jews. One of the most famous examples of this kind of argument was a famous article. It was actually originally a speech printed as an article by another chancellor of JTS, funnily enough, who whose name is escaping me at the moment. It'll come back to me in just a moment. Gerson Cohen, sorry about that. Chancellor Gerson Cohen was a Jewish historian who gave a very famous speech along these lines. The title of the speech was The Blessing of Assimilation. And in giving that speech, he knew full well that many Jews, certainly many of those in his audience that day, looked upon assimilation as second only to anti-Semitism, as a terrible threat to Jews, as a kind of evil. If any of you attended a yeshiva or the like, you may recall being taught this, that the two great enemies of the Jews both start with the letter A. Anti-Semitism is one, and assimilation is the other. Well, historians like myself and Gerson Cohen and others, as you're hearing, have a more balanced view. And Cohen, in that famous classic article of his, made the point that Jews throughout history have been subject to, throughout the diaspora rather, have been subject to the tendency, the process of cultural assimilation. It's different from what sociologists call structural assimilation, when one not only becomes Greek or Roman, not only is Hellenized, but in the process abandons one's Jewishness, leaves behind one's Jewish identity entirely, leaves the Jewish people in order to become something else. We sociologists call that structural assimilation. Gerson Cohen was talking about something very different. He was talking about cultural assimilation, which also known as acculturation, which means learning the language of your new setting. It means beginning to dress a little bit more rather looking different as Jews, you dress like everyone else in your society. You're acculturating, you're assimilating its culture. You may no longer have a Jewish name. You might have a Greek or Latin name, right? I mentioned Josephus Flavius has a Romanized name. Benedict Spinoza had a European name also. So this is how many of you, your first name, is it an English Americanized name, or is it a biblical, traditionally Jewish name? Now, as you all are thinking, well, we Jews have at least two names often. We have our diaspora name, and we still have a memory. We retain the memory of our Jewish name, which we use on certain occasions. And that duality is a perfect example of what Gerson Cohen meant by cultural assimilation. You don't leave behind or entirely lose your Jewishness. You simply layer onto it a new culture. And that ability to learn a new culture is a form of adjustment and accommodation that Jews have been doing throughout our very lengthy diaspora history, again and again. In each new diaspora, we have created a new Jewish culture based upon a new cultural synthesis. That amazing history of accommodation is what Gerson Cohen was referring to by the blessing of assimilation. We Jews throughout our history have become expert at preserving our own identity as Jews. If I forget the O Jerusalem, that reminds me who I am as a Jew, where I originally came from, contains a bit of a lament. I'm in exile. But we've combined that with, we're in a new place, let's build houses and raise families and contribute to this society. That duality, that balance, has been characteristic of Jewish life for many centuries. It's a survival mechanism. I said earlier today that it might be argued that the Torah is the guarantor of our survival. Another historian might argue that no, it's this particular habit of thought and action that we Jews have acquired and passed down from generation to generation, of learning to live in two, as Rabbi Mordechai Kaplan called it, learning to live in two civilizations at the same time. That's a Jewish specialty. Obviously, there are other people other than Jews that have done this and are good at it, but we're the world's experts, right? We have done this again and again, and it has been to our benefit. And one can then proceed from there to argue that not only have we been good at diaspora, but diaspora has been good to us. Think about, especially in the modern world, or not just in the modern world, think about starting with, we could go back to the Babylonian exile. I'll go back to Rabbinic Judaism. 2 sessions from now, we'll be talking about Rabbinic Judaism, the Judaism of the Mishnah, Gemara, the Talmud, and of Midrash in particular. This again, yet another amazing religious literature that we generated, the rabbis created. They created it in part in the land of Israel, but an awful lot of it, especially the Talmud, was created in diaspora. And one could then trace every new iteration and development in the extraordinary history of Judaism again and again. It is life in diaspora that provides the context for the creation of Kabbalah, medieval Jewish philosophy, certainly modern Jewish thought. It is the catalyst of living in between cultures, of living sort of at home, but not entirely at home. That has been our secret sauce, if you will. So that's the argument that diaspora has been very good for us. One then adds to that, look at all the great achievements and cultural and scientific accomplishments by Jews in the modern world, all of those Jewish Nobel Prize winners. Well, some of them live in Israel, but the majority of them historically have lived in that more tenuous situation in between Galut and diaspora. And that, the argument goes, is generative. It helps. It's what makes the Jews special in the modern world. Right? We traditionally, our memory is that we are special because God chose us. Well, there's truth in that. That's the one of the core messages of our Torah, that we have believed that for many, many centuries. But look what happens once that's called into question in the modern world. Jews have continued to behave in a distinctive, singular, often extraordinary way. And that's the result of diaspora. That's the abrasion that creates the pearl in the oyster of Jewish achievement in the modern world is diaspora. So there is an argument that diaspora is very good for Jews. Obviously, there's also an argument that no, the diaspora is what led to the Holocaust, right? It's very, very bad for Jews. We live in that tension. Nevertheless, and here I'll end today, I didn't really talk about the Hellenistic era. Do we have time to go back to that? I kind of glossed over that. I'm going to skip that for today. I apologize. Let me just go to this, my concluding thought, which is that there is today, as you all know, Israel has become very contentious in our Jewish community. Most American Jews are quite committed to Israel and supportive of Israel and are very Zionistic. But there is a growing movement, especially amongst younger people, of a kind of oppositional anti-Zionism. You're all aware of this. I'm sure for many of you it's painful, not a pleasant thing. But to better understand it, one can and should apply what we've been talking about today. There is related to the political movement of anti-Zionism and anti-Israel, related to it, not exactly the same, but related to it, is a new movement, a relatively new movement that, in opposition to Zionism, calls itself diasporism. It is the ideology that not only is diaspora good for Jews, but having our own state and reconstituting Jewish life in Israel is actually bad for the Jews. And if you want to understand this contemporary debate between Zionists and anti-Zionists, I think it helps to add this to the mix, this related or underlying debate as to the wisdom for a Jew of living in one's homeland or in diaspora. That the sharpness of that divide has reasserted itself. So I'll just end by, again, restating that for most of Jewish history, we held these two things in balance. And that balance was an important factor in Jewish creativity and Jewish survival. As is true of many things in today's world, the balance is currently out of whack, let's say. With that, I'll end. I'll turn to Sherelle. We have a few minutes for questions, do we not?
Perfect. Yes. And we might go a little over the time just to get to a few more questions. I'll start with like the smaller ones that are more, there was a question about, maybe they're smaller, maybe I'm mistaken, about the letter of Jeremiah that you read, if you relate to it as history or memory.
Thank you. Great question. I sort of said it, but you're giving me the chance to restate it. It's in the Bible. Your first assumption in reading the Bible is that this is a book of memory. Interrogating it through a historical lens, we historians, nowadays agree that as is true of much of the later part of the Bible, which is written contemporaneously with the Babylonian exile. So historians don't call that into question. That certainly happened. It may not have happened exactly the way it's recorded in the Bible, but certainly it was a historical event. The exile community was a historical reality. The emotions and response to that on the part of Jewish thinkers and spiritual leaders was very real, was very historical. Once it gets put down in the Bible, it becomes for everyone thereafter our memory. So it's a nice example of how the two are often a kind of a yin and a yang. It's both history and memory, and it operates in that tension. The events themselves are certainly historical. The way the text then operates in Jewish culture is a matter of memory because, as I said in our very first session, we Jews are not a nation of historians. We are not trained to think that way. That's a new way of thinking. The way we are trained to think is this is God's holy Bible. This has ultimate truth. And so to find these two competing ideas, ay vey, woe is me, I'm no longer in Jerusalem, and where I am, I'm going to make the best of it. The fact that we have both of those in the Bible is just really beautiful, that the two attitudes that conform to the history and memory divide, in this case, are both in that foundational text.
Thank you. So there's another question that is related to history and text about Psalms, because the quote is obviously after the time of David. So historically, it would mean that David didn't write the whole of Psalms, even though we relate it to him. So would you say here, again, a question of history or memory, or how?
Yeah, in terms of understanding the interpretation of the question of who wrote the Bible, Jewish tradition, which begins, as with this case of the letter to the exiles, Jewish tradition is created in the moment. So the tradition that certain texts were authored by someone who lived much earlier, that becomes very common in the biblical period. The assignment of this text that I've just written to some great figure of the past becomes a kind of habit, as a way of giving the text greater authority and greater sanctity. This will be done. I mentioned the Zohar, the 13th century amazing work of Kabbalah. The author of the Kabbalah, of the Zohar, did not identify himself, but rather said this was composed by Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, a rabbi of the Mishnah, 1,000 years earlier. Right, so that was simply continuing that practice, if you will, or that habit of assigning it to someone earlier. There are books of the Bible that are assigned to Solomon, to King David. Historians reject all of that. There may have been certain passages or certain phrases that are that old, but as a composed book in and of itself, it's centuries later, as we discussed last week.
Perfect. I'm skipping forward in time to this notion of exile and diaspora. In the US, can you maybe say a few words about the denominations and timeline of the shift from relating to the places exile versus diaspora?
Well, that's my real field. So I have too much to say about that. There's applying it to the history of American Judaism. I'll say briefly that one of the tensions that emerged in the 19th century in American Judaism, and that is still with us, is between those Judaisms that are very invested in life in America, and that this is our new, in fact, there was a very famous phrase that was uttered in a synagogue dedication in Charleston, South Carolina, in the year 1841, I think, or maybe 1840. And there was Gustavus Poznansky, who was the Chazan, who said, "This city is our new Jerusalem. This land is our new Zion." Right? And that later will become a characteristic attitude of classical Reform Judaism. The rejection of that age-old connection to Zion. It will be in direct opposition to the new movement of Zionism in the late 19th century. Most Reform Jews of the time will say, no, this is our Zion. This is our home. And they'll kind of fuse that. Then as Zionism grows in popularity in America, one or another of the other movements will adopt it. Most notably, conservative Judaism will adopt Zionism from the start, but not in a shlilat hagalut vein. That will not happen. Conservative Judaism and American Orthodoxy are sufficiently American and Americanized that they are not willing to go that far, and they develop a new form of Zionism that validates life in Israel and life in the diaspora. And as I think I did say, that most American Jews today are more or less both Zionist and diasporist, as we believe we can have two centers and one doesn't negate the other. That was the attitude of conservative Judaism, and that is the majority attitude of Jews today. But again, as I say, there are growing numbers of people on both sides of that, a growing number of people that are hewing now to an extreme. Only Israel, only America, that divide has reopened, I'm afraid.
Okay. Is there a way for you also very briefly to say about was there a shift within Israeli thought from galut to tfutzot, to diaspora, from exile to diaspora?
I think I laugh because I know and love a lot of Israelis, and a lot of them have traveled and broadened their horizons and really like it here in New York, or a lot of Israelis moved to Berlin and elsewhere around the world, and they've found new homes for themselves, and so clearly they don't have that feeling. But an awful lot of Israelis, for understandable reasons, are still very defensive of their life decision to live in an embattled state of Israel. And they defend that, completely understandable, in part by emphasizing how wonderful Jewish life is here and the concomitant emphasis on how lacking Jewish life is elsewhere. You can't really be a real Jew anywhere but in Israel. That's a typically Zionist and Israeli attitude. Again, there are always lots of exceptions, but many of my Israeli relatives and friends would make that kind of statement, whether they're aware of it or not. It is a kind of a more gentle or more subtle form of shlilat hagalut. Right?
Okay, thank you. I think we covered the major ones, and some of them you actually answered as we were going along. So thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Looking for.
You know what? I skipped over the Hellenistic piece of this. I will do that in next class. So those of you who missed it, we'll get to it.
Okay, lovely. As usual, I'll be sending the follow-up email with the recording, and David, I'll be asking you for all those lovely maps that people already requested so that we can do. Yes. Happy Sukkot, everyone, and have a good day, evening.
Zman Simchatenu. This is the. You think Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur were the high holidays? No. Sukkot is the high holiday, folks.